All right, so I haven't made a video in a while, but I got something in new today that I haven't really seen a whole lot about yet on YouTube, and I saw them on AliExpress and had to get them and try them right off the bat. These are portal axles for the WPL trucks, and they're built by JGRC. They are plastic, but they do have metal internals. It's a fairly hard engineering plastic. It should be reasonably durable. The bushing isn't in here. These do come with bushings in them. I paid about $18 for both front and rear axles. Unfortunately, they don't seem to sell them individually. Please, all you manufacturers, if you're going to make components for these WPLs, sell at the very least the front axles alone for all of us that want to do 4-wheel or 6-wheel steering setups. That being said, they add 10 millimeters of width, and I do believe 11 or 12 millimeters of height. You can see that's a pretty significant amount of increased ground clearance. They do also reduce the gear ratio a little bit. So for those of you that are running bigger tires or crawling setups, but with a stock transmission that doesn't have that low of a gear ratio, you might actually benefit from these quite a bit. You can run droop style suspension where your suspension is not fully extended all the time for more flex and retain your ground clearance using an axle like this. They do come with steering rods. The lower one is plastic. The upper one is kind of standard to the wire sets that are already out there. So one thing you may notice is that they are assembled flipped compared to the factory axles, and I do believe that's intentional. For those of you that have run the 6-wheel drives, you may know that if you flip an axle, it changes the direction of rotation. I think that they're doing that intentionally in this case because the gearbox is on the end, change the direction of the rotation, so this brings it back to normal. But that being said, the way these hubs are built, you can take them off and you can flip the axles if you have a more unusual setup. Like my truck, I have one of these gearhead motor gearboxes, and I run it backwards. This is the front of the truck. I run it backwards to the normal setup. They're intended for you to put them in the other direction, but I do this trying to get more weight up in the front. Now, one of the things I noticed right off the bat is that this is really, really badly bound in the front axle. Let me grab a wheel here. I can turn it, but barely. There's a lot of friction in there. And I have figured out why, and it's fairly easy to correct, but we shouldn't have to make corrections like this. But for $18, I'm not going to complain. I can spend a few minutes with a file. What's happening in here is the ring gear is actually rubbing on the top of the housing. And so I'm going to tear both these axles all the way down so you can see how they work and the internals. And then I'll reassemble them and install them on this truck. Okay, to start with, I'm going to tear down the rear axle. One of the things to note with these, and this is true for pretty much any WPL axle, is if you don't have a drive shaft on them, watch out for this bushing. It will fall out. Of course, now that I want to, it won't. There we go. When I got this package, both of the bushings were free floating in the bag. They are the same size as the bearings that we would normally use, except they do appear to be slightly thicker. I don't think this will hurt things much, but you might need to use some shims if you're going to use these bearings and convert them. But there is also some bearings that are similar and slightly wider. Maybe worth looking into to put into these. At some point in the future, I will measure all these and find out what exactly you need. There's also some larger bearings in here, as you'll see in a few minutes, that we'll have to order separately. So here you can see the end of the original axle. And so there's a pinion gear around this and a larger gear down here. There's only one screw on the front. And then if we flip it over, there's two on the back. Now these two are shorter than the front ones and slightly smaller, so don't get them switched. Something I want to say, anytime you get aftermarket axles for these trucks, you really should do a complete teardown and re-grease. So there's the larger bearing that I was talking about, or bushing in this case, but we would need a larger bearing in order to convert these to ball bearings. So there's the gear reduction. And I don't remember it off the top of my head, but I will put the ratio above that this reduces it by. For most people, this isn't going to be a problem, but if you run a rig that already has a really low gear ratio like this has, you may find this starts to get too slow to where you can crawl really well, but you can't get that little burst to hop when you need to. So this gear is retained by a pin. I like seeing this rather than a set screw because, as we all know, set screws have a tendency to back out at the most inconvenient times, even when you use Loctite sometimes. Now, inside here, this one has a D cut to match the flat spot on the end of the axle. Inside here, we'll see two more screws. These screws will remove the portal adapter plate. And then that will slide right off. Now, this is where you can flip these axles if you need to change the direction. So there's nothing stopping you from flipping it around and putting it right back on like that, putting the screws back in. Should allow you to flip the direction for rotation. And that's important on the front axle, and I'll point it out when we get to it. These axles have something that the WPL factory axles lack. I do actually think that if you were willing to do some modifications with a Dremel and epoxy these in place, you could possibly put these portal reduction boxes onto some of the aluminum housings. Now, here is where these are going to deviate a little bit from the factory WPL axles. If you look really close, you'll see that on the original axles, the seam for the axle housing runs this way. So you have a top and a bottom. And the diff covers hold it together as well as the screws driven through here. Now, on these, they have chosen to go this way, front and back. And I think that was actually a pretty good choice. I think that makes for an ever so slightly stronger axle. There are definitely some differences in design between the housings, but as far as the front and rear covers go, they mount very, very much in the same way. One of the things that I was immediately happy to see opening it up, on top of there actually being a decent amount of grease in there, is that you have these little divots, which I do believe are, let's change it so the light can get to it better. I do believe these divots are actually for the 6-wheel drive pass-through upgraded center axle, because it has an additional shaft that passes all the way through. So for those not familiar, there's 2 different ways to get 6-wheel drive. The original method was to have a second front just flipped and put on the back, which works okay, but there's some minor issues with it. And then the upgraded kit has a couple of pinions in here and a secondary shaft that passes through and comes out the kind of the top side of the housing, so that the direction of rotation stays the same going all the way through the axle. It takes some of the slack out. Now we've got a steel pinion and ring gear set. Should be pretty standard what you would see for most of the axle internal upgrades. And like I was talking about before, the axle is going to split front to back instead of top to bottom. And again, we see we've got the standard bearing or standard bushing sizes. Something I noticed is that the pinion bushings do seem to be the only ones that are slightly thicker. I could be wrong on that. Could just be my lighting in here. They feel like they're slightly thicker. Now, the friction problem that I saw that's in the front axle, the rear axle doesn't seem to have it, but it's from rubbing right here on both sides. So it feels a little too close here. I might modify this a little bit with a small file, but it isn't as important as it is in the front end. All new axles like this are going to have a little bit of a break-in period, and you can actually speed that up by once they're all assembled, checking the input shaft into a drill and manually spinning it for a little while with some good grease in here, letting the gears wear into each other. All right, so I'm going to set that aside. I'll reassemble that later, and we'll move on to the front axle, which is a bit more complicated. It's got a little bit more going on. Okay, so moving on to the front axles. When I say they are a little bit more complicated, I don't mean mechanically. They have pretty much the same components that the rear axle does, with the addition of U-joints. But what I mean by that is, if you look at the original WPL axles, ignoring that this one has leaf springs, the steering knuckle line is completely vertical to the rest of the axle. And if you look at real vehicles, this is almost never the case. And it causes some weird steering issues with the truck. More conventionally, you will have just a little bit of caster, so being angled back. This is the front of the truck, and that causes the front wheels to kind of lean just a little bit during turning, and it works out a lot better than to be vertical, which tends to cause the tires to kind of skid a little bit. So these axles do actually have that angle. I don't know if the camera is really going to catch it, but you can kind of see that this is set back a little farther than it's down here. Should be a much more accurate steering. Now, this does become the one point of concern with portal axles. So while you do get increased clearance underneath the axle, you do also have to have these steep blocks to grab the lower part of the steering knuckle. And so what ends up happening is that while you have tremendously increased the clearance under here, you now have this hanging out, getting ready to hang up on every rock that gets to the inside of your tire. So as with everything in racing and off-roading, everything's a compromise. Any system that is an improvement in one area will cause an opposite effect in a different area. Now, overall, I think the benefits outweigh the problems in this case. One thing I do really like seeing in these is that the steering or the lower steering rod is actually held in double shear. So the screw that holds this assembly together is under a lot less stress, and it also sits at a much higher position than the factory lower rod. As you can see down here, the front tie rod is much closer to the top of the differential screws, whereas the factory one's much closer to the bottom. So that's increased clearance and increased approach angle when you come up against something. The steering rod's much less likely to hit first. So that's a compound clearance thing. And being in double shear means there's a lot less stress on it. I see a lot of people take the factory axles, they move the bar up to the top, and then they have the tie rod going up to the steering servo stacked on top of that. So over here you have this double stack under a ton of stress. In fact, my own personal truck, as it's set up right now, has this exact problem going on. Mounted to the top for more clearance, but that also means that this upper rod is stacked onto it, and there is a lot of stress. Oops, out of shot. There's a lot of stress on this upper screw now. Not to mention the torsional force it puts on the steering knuckles arm. All right, so next I'm going to go ahead and tear this axle down. And there goes the bushing again. So I'm going to start by pulling this screw out, removing the tie rods. So this seems to be a really decent plastic that they built this out of. I don't think there'll be a lot of issues with most builds in this tie rod, but it might be worth considering looking for a similar small tie rod ends like this, but that don't have this flare at the bottom. It looks to me like there is plenty of clearance for one that's built without the flare to fit right in there. Starting into the knuckles, one of the things I really liked seeing right off the bat is that there is a brass bushing in here. So this should last a lot longer. So I appear to have misplaced my Allen wrench set, but if you carefully pull, that will slide out. Now, this assembly is functionally very similar to the rear end. It's going to have the same gear set inside it. One difference being this much larger bearing or bushing to go around the outside of the drive cup. Now, getting back to the angle on this, you can see it a lot better right now. So we're looking at the opposite side that I was showing before, but you can definitely see the angle on it. Now, one of the places where this is going to become really important, and like I said, for flipping the axle to change the rotation direction, not only can you flip the axle, you can also change which sides these are on. So flipping them this way. And the reason you would want to do that is if you're going to use this as a rear axle on a four-wheel steering truck, you are not going to want this angle to now be the wrong direction. So what will happen now is rather than your front wheels will lean into the turns, your rear wheels will now dive into the turns, and you do not want that. So to use this as a rear axle, you're going to want to pull both sides off and flip them around. That'll get your angles going the correct direction, and again, everything should act normal. So just like the rears, you would pull these two screws. So apparently I had a failure to record, so if it looks like I jumped ahead, it's because I did. So the other side's already off because that's what I was recording and lost. But now that I've got the right size Allen wrench, we're going to pull this little set screw. And it's stiff because it feels like they've Loctited them. Ooh. I may not be able to do this with a straight-handled wrench. Okay, so we're going to pull this set screw. And pull the universal joint off. Now, watch the pin in this. The pin will slide out really easily. There isn't room for a snap ring like you would see in the factory WPL upgraded drive shafts. In this case, the bushing or the bearing around it actually holds it together. But now with that out of the way, you can see this accentuates the caster angle even more now that you can see these two screws in relation to the angle. And that right there, that screw was loose. This is one of the reasons why I really recommend anytime you do any upgrades, you take that transmission or that axle apart when you receive it and check everything out. In the case of this one, I had one over-tightened screw that slightly deformed the top of one of the hubs, and I also found that the differential cover screws were actually loose on both axles. Now, with these two screws out, now you're free to flip it over to change the direction of the axle's rotation, or if you need to make this a rear axle, flip the axle around the opposite direction and install it. And now you can see with it going in the opposite direction, this will now make a rear axle that'll have the correct caster. So these axles are really flexible, and in some ways I feel like a kind of a bit of an improvement over the factory WPL axles. Now, here's where the issue that I mentioned with this axle comes into play. So I'm going to hold it all together tightly and try to turn this input gear. And right now it feels like it's spinning fairly freely. But with everything assembled, I was running into issues. And I have a feeling that part of where the issues come from is rubbing at the top and the bottom here. Although now that it's apart, I feel like I might be not correct on that. I wonder if it was somehow rubbing the inside of the cover. Let me reassemble this real fast and let's see. That's interesting. Now that they're off, I don't have any binding issues. There's a tiny bit of binding, but it's actually not that bad. It makes me wonder if maybe the binding issues were coming from one of these being set slightly too tight. That seems almost impossible from this angle. Okay, I see now where it's possible to get the binding. So if you look at the flat, the D-cut flat here, it actually sits slightly inside. The back of it does. So these need to be spaced out ever so slightly during reassembly. Maybe if this is an issue getting this set right while you're assembling it, maybe put a piece of paper in between there as a spacer and then tighten it down, pull the paper out. Because yeah, now that I've got them off, the friction that I would expect from a brand new axle, yeah, this seems fine. Also, maybe an interesting note for people who do custom building, this would actually make an excellent rear axle on its own like this for a small tractor build. If you were to take the regular hex hubs off normal rear axle and put them on here. Anyways, that aside though, I'm going to find out which direction I need them to run for my particular build and reassemble them off camera, and then the next video will be me swapping them out, putting them on this truck.